The year was 1928, a world staggering between two wars, dragging its shadow of fear and fever. Hospitals overflowed with soldiers from the last great conflict. 1 in every 5 had not died from bullets, but from infection. No cure, no salvation, just silence and fever. And then, in a cluttered lab at St. Mary's Hospital, London, a forgotten petri dish began to bloom. A green-blue mold, quiet and uninvited, spread across a colony of deadly bacteria. When Dr. Alexander Fleming returned from vacation, he saw something that made him freeze. Around that mold, the bacteria had simply vanished. Was this luck, accident, or something greater, hiding inside a speck of decay? Fleming leaned close to the dish, eyes sharp, heart pounding, and scribbled in his notes. Mold juice, capable of killing bacteria. He named it penicillin. But science, like war, moves at the pace of belief. The world was not ready. Funding was scarce. Laboratories distracted by the thunderclouds of politics and rearmament. Fleming's discovery was buried under 10 years of dust, published once and forgotten, a ghost in the archives of medicine. Meanwhile, outside that quiet London lab, the world was tightening. Nations rear-armed. Industry roared. Armies drilled beneath banners of pride and fear. Doctors still used sulfur drugs, primitive, unreliable, and every hospital ward knew the same refrain: we can amputate, or we can pray. By 1938, infection was still the unseen killer. In civilian hospitals, sepsis claimed thousands each month. In military training camps, a scratch could turn lethal. And by the end of the decade, whispers of another world war were everywhere. The irony burned cold. Humanity could send planes into the sky, yet not heal a wound on the ground. Somewhere, Fleming's petri dish sat on a dusty shelf, a relic of what might have been. He had tried to persuade others, but chemistry failed him. Penicillin was fragile, unstable, nearly impossible to extract in pure form. It was like chasing light in a bottle. Still, something in him refused to die. "There's a secret here," he once murmured to a colleague, "if someone has the patience to find it." History, as it turned out, was listening. Because in the next chapter across the channel, in the dim labs of Oxford University, 2 men would open Fleming's forgotten paper and ignite the race that would change medicine forever. A race not fought with guns, but with glass beakers and faith. A race to turn a single drop of mold into the miracle that would save millions. The world was dragging itself into another storm. By 1939, Europe was on fire again, nations arming, cities trembling. The First World War had already bled 20 million lives, but its cruelest secret was not the bullet or the bomb, it was infection. In the trenches of 1917, more soldiers had died from sepsis than from enemy fire. Every small cut became a sentence, every wound a whisper of death. And now, it was happening again. When the first shots of the Second World War echoed across Poland, doctors already knew the numbers. 18% of wounded soldiers in the previous war had died from infection. That statistic haunted every battlefield medic, every surgeon who held a trembling scalpel under flickering light. They could fight the war, but could they fight the rot that came after? In Oxford, England, far from the roar of tanks, 2 scientists refused to accept that question. Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, reopened an old paper by a forgotten man, Alexander Fleming. The title was simple, dusty, almost absurd in its understatement: On the Antibacterial Action of Penicillium Mold. Chain read it aloud one night, voice sharp in the lamplight. "What if this actually works?" Florey paused. Then it could change everything. They had no funding, no equipment. Britain was rationing everything: fuel, food, even glassware. Oxford's laboratories leaked during the rain. The air raid sirens wailed through the night. Yet inside those walls, the 2 men began what history would later call the most important medical experiment of the century. They worked fast, scraping green mold off old bread, growing cultures in ceramic pots and tin biscuit tins. Students helped filter the liquid through bedsheets. Women from the cleaning staff washed and reused every flask. It was desperation turned into devotion. By early 1940, they had enough crude penicillin to test on a single mouse. That night, they injected 8 mice with lethal bacteria and gave 4 of them penicillin. By morning, the untreated mice were dead. The others were alive, grooming themselves in the cage. Chain wrote in his journal, his hand shaking, "It works. God help us, it actually works." But a mouse wasn't enough. They needed proof, human proof. In February 1941, a policeman named Albert Alexander arrived at Radcliffe Infirmary. A rose thorn had scratched his face. The infection had spread to his eyes, his lungs, his blood. He was dying. The doctors had no options left except one. Florey's team administered the world's first human dose of penicillin. Within 24 hours, Alexander's fever broke. His pulse steadied. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. The room erupted in hope. Nurses wept. Students wrote down the data with trembling hands. It was as if light had cracked through the walls of war. But the triumph was brief. The team had so little penicillin that within days they began recycling Alexander's urine to recover the drug. Even that wasn't enough. The infection returned and the policeman died, but his temporary recovery proved what mattered most. Penicillin worked inside the human body. Florey knew what that meant. If they could make enough of it, they could change the face of medicine and maybe, just maybe, save the war's next generation from dying of dirt and bacteria. Yet time was running out. Bombs fell on London nightly. Laboratories across Europe went dark. Supplies of medical alcohol and sugar were nearly gone. Britain could not mass-produce penicillin. It didn't have the resources, nor the industrial capacity. So Florey made a decision that would rewrite history. He packed a suitcase with glass vials of mold spores, stitched extra samples inside his coat just in case he was searched, and boarded a military transport plane bound for America. Behind him, Oxford continued to burn under the Luftwaffe's raids. Ahead of him, a new frontier waited. Industrial America, the only place on Earth capable of turning this fragile discovery into a weapon against disease. When Florey landed in Peoria, Illinois, he met scientists from Pfizer, Merck, and the US Department of Agriculture. They listened, skeptical at first, until he said one line that cut through the noise. "Gentlemen, the next war will not be won by bullets alone." The Americans understood numbers, and these were numbers that mattered. In World War I, 30,000 soldiers had died from bacterial infection alone. In World War II, projections showed millions could face the same fate without a new medicine. It wasn't a choice, it was a call to arms. By mid-1941, US labs began testing deep tank fermentation, a radical method that could grow penicillium in huge steel vats. It was risky, expensive, almost impossible, but hope was feeding the furnaces now. And as the war thundered on, penicillin's story was no longer confined to a lab. It was spreading like the mold itself through nations, factories, and faith. Next came the factories that never slept, the engineers who bent steel for science, and the moment the drug that began in a petri dish would reach the battlefield. The race had begun, to turn a forgotten mold into the miracle that would save millions. Europe was burning. The Pacific was drowning in fire. Every day, thousands of soldiers fell not from bullets but from infection. In North Africa alone, over 12,000 Allied troops were hospitalized with infected wounds. By winter, half would die without a single dose of penicillin. And the math was merciless. If nothing changed, the war would end with 1 million men buried by bacteria, not bombs. America heard that number and understood. The war machine could forge tanks, build ships, drop iron from the sky, but none of it meant anything if men couldn't survive their own wounds. The battlefield wasn't just the front line anymore. It was inside the bloodstream. So, in the industrial heart of Peoria, Illinois, a new kind of army was born, scientists in lab coats, engineers in steel boots, hauling barrels instead of rifles. Their mission: turn a fragile British discovery into a flood of life-saving medicine. Howard Florey arrived with little more than a suitcase of spores and faith. He stood before executives of Pfizer, Merck, and Eli Lilly, his voice cutting through the static of war. "Gentlemen, we can't win this war with bullets alone. We need a weapon that heals." Pfizer's president, Charles Pfizer Jr., didn't blink. He looked at the numbers. Producing penicillin required 40 times more resources than beer, and no one had ever grown mold on an industrial scale. But America had no time for impossible. The company took the risk. They called it Project X, a top-secret race against death itself. In hidden factories along the East Coast, engineers repurposed old fermentation tanks once used for citric acid. The challenge was brutal. The penicillium mold refused to grow in shallow trays. It suffocated under its own foam. Then, by a twist of genius, a U.S. Department of Agriculture lab in Peoria discovered a golden clue, a strain of Penicillium chrysogenum thriving inside a moldy cantaloupe from a local market. It produced 6 times more penicillin than Fleming's original culture. They named it the Peoria strain. With that, the race exploded. Pfizer engineers began experimenting with deep tank fermentation, forcing air through giant steel vats 20 feet high. The process looked like chaos, pipes hissing, steam roaring, gauges trembling, but inside those tanks, history was fermenting. Every 12 hours, workers in goggles and aprons scraped the frothing mold, filtered the yellow liquid, and distilled it into powder. The yield, in the beginning, barely enough to fill a teaspoon. By the end of 19432, 3 million doses a month. It was an industrial resurrection. Factories that once made paint or yeast were now brewing salvation. Scientists slept on concrete floors beside the tanks, taking shifts to monitor pressure and temperature. They moved like soldiers in a new kind of war, a war fought with patience, steel, and belief. The U.S. War Production Board classified penicillin as top priority essential for victory. By mid-1943, factories in Brooklyn, Kalamazoo, and Terre Haute were humming day and night. Railroad cars carried crates marked only "Penicillin Urgent." Military convoys guarded them like gold. For the first time, medicine moved with the same urgency as ammunition. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British hospitals were still rationing single vials. A wounded pilot might get 1 injection, then nothing more. Nurses recycled the urine of treated patients, desperate to recover every trace of the drug. But by the summer of '43, the miracle had crossed the ocean. American shipments of penicillin began arriving in London, the first of millions. Numbers tell the story. In 1940, the world produced less than 100 doses of penicillin in total. By 1943, the United States alone produced 21 billion units, enough to treat tens of thousands of soldiers each month. And by D-Day, 1944, every Allied medic carried it in his kit. Behind every vial was a human victory. Women filled the factories, the penicillin girls, wearing uniforms and scarves, scrubbing glassware until their hands blistered. Engineers burned through nights recalibrating machines, watching pressure valves like snipers. The air reeked of alcohol and yeast. The sound of compressors never stopped, but no one complained. They knew what was at stake. Every batch of penicillin meant another soldier might see home again. Another letter might make it back across the ocean. The breakthrough was more than scientific. It was moral. For the first time, humanity had created a weapon that did not destroy but preserved life. In late 1943, when Florey walked through Pfizer's Brooklyn plant, he stopped before the roaring vats, eyes shining under the harsh factory lights. "It's no longer in our hands," he said quietly. "It belongs to the world now." Outside, the war was reaching its crescendo, bombs over Italy, flames over London, the Pacific turning red. But inside those tanks, another kind of war was being won, invisible, relentless, fed by belief. By the end of 1943, penicillin had transformed from a forgotten mold into the most powerful drug on Earth. The next year, it would march onto the beaches of Normandy, carried in pouches beside bandages and bullets, and rewrite the fate of an entire generation. The industrial miracle had begun. Europe was a continent of ash, dragging dust through every broken city, every shattered field. On the Western Front alone, the Allies prepared to land over 156,000 soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. The planners had done the math. In the First World War, 18 out of every 100 wounded soldiers had died not from bullets, but from infection. If that ratio repeated here, the invasion would collapse under its own dead. Penicillin had to arrive before the troops did. Across America, factories pulsed like beating hearts. Pfizer's Brooklyn plant roared 24 hours a day, its steel tanks exhaling clouds of steam into the night. Workers hauled crates marked "Penicillin for military use only" onto convoys that thundered east. The air reeked of alcohol and yeast. Trains rattled through snow and blackout zones, guarded like weapons of war. By June 1944, the miracle was ready. The United States had produced 2.3 million doses per month, enough to equip every medic who would storm Normandy. Soldiers carried penicillin in metal tins alongside bullets and morphine. For the first time in history, an army marched to battle with the power to fight infection. And then June 6th, D-Day. The beaches of France erupted in fire and fear. Machine guns tore through the surf. But behind the chaos came the quiet miracle. Medics crawling through smoke, pressing gauze soaked with penicillin into wounds. For the first time, the story didn't end with fever and gangrene. Doctors recorded it in disbelief. Wounds that once rotted now heal clean. In the first 6 weeks after Normandy, the rate of death from infection dropped below 1%. It was not luck. It was science sharpened by necessity, fueled by human will. By 1945, Allied hospitals across Europe were flooded not with dying men, but with recovering ones. The change was staggering. During World War I, more than 30,000 soldiers had died from infected wounds. In World War II, thanks to penicillin, the number fell by more than 95%. In Italy, doctors reported soldiers returning to combat within 10 days of injury. In the Pacific, Marines wounded by shrapnel lived to tell their stories. And in England, the newspapers began printing headlines that sounded almost biblical: "The drug that conquers death." Still, the work never stopped. Behind every headline was a chain of sleepless nights, scientists, nurses, factory women, all feeding the miracle. The Peoria strain, once found in a grocery store melon, now grew in hundreds of tanks across America. By late 1944, penicillin output reached 650 billion units a year. But the miracle had its cost. The men who made it were haunted by what they saw. Reports from battlefields told of burned villages, mass graves, and hospitals where penicillin arrived too late. For every soldier saved, 10 civilians lay unburied. The contrast tore at the conscience of science itself, the dual face of war, destruction feeding discovery. Howard Florey toured the Allied hospitals in France that winter. He walked through wards lined with bandaged men, eyes hollow, skin pale but alive. A nurse whispered, "Before this, half of them would be gone by morning." Florey didn't reply. He just watched a medic inject another soldier and thought of the first test mouse back in Oxford, the same logic, the same faith, now stretched across a continent. By early 1945, the numbers were staggering. The US Army estimated that over 200,000 Allied soldiers had been saved by penicillin during the war. That's not just a number, that's an entire city of lives spared. Each dose cost less than a bullet, yet changed more than a battle. In January, with Germany collapsing, shipments of penicillin were redirected to field hospitals near the Ardennes. Frost bit through canvas tents. Wounded men lay under flickering lanterns. A medic named John Thompson wrote home, "The only warmth out here is from the syringe." And somewhere in a trench, under snow and silence, a wounded private whispered as the medicine entered his vein, "It burns, but it feels like hope." Penicillin had become more than a drug. It was a symbol, the proof that humanity could still build, even as it destroyed. In April 1945, as Allied forces entered Buchenwald, doctors carried penicillin into the concentration camps. Prisoners too weak to stand were given injections. Some lived. Most did not. But the gesture mattered, a final act of mercy in a world starved of it. When the war ended in August, the factories did not stop. Pfizer's tanks kept humming, now for civilians, not soldiers. The drug that had begun as a British accident, reborn in an American factory, was ready to face a new enemy, disease itself. From the rubble of war, a new medical empire was born. The same industrial might that once forged bombs now forged cures. Florey, Chain, and Fleming, three names from different nations, stood side by side that December in Stockholm, receiving the Nobel Prize in Medicine. The hall fell silent as the citation was read. For the discovery and production of penicillin, which has saved the lives of countless human beings. Countless. The word itself was a monument. As the applause faded, Florey whispered to Fleming, "You realize this isn't the end." Fleming nodded, eyes downcast. "No," he said quietly, "it's the beginning of something far greater." And it was, because after 1945, penicillin would leave the battlefield and step into the bloodstream of humanity itself. From the deserts of Africa to the hospitals of New York, from the wounds of soldiers to the infections of children, it would carry a new kind of power, the power to heal without hate. The war had forged a miracle, and in doing so, had reminded the world what it truly meant to survive. The guns fell silent. Europe exhaled, dragging dust, smoke, and ghosts into the cold wind of peace. Factories that once forged steel for destruction now pulsed with the rhythm of creation. The war had ended, but its echo refused to die. It rumbled through the ruins of London, the rubble of Berlin, the burned-out hospitals of Warsaw. And in the middle of that silence stood a small glass vial, clear, fragile, almost weightless. Inside it, a golden liquid shimmered like the memory of survival, penicillin. The miracle born from mold, from accident, from faith. By 1946, the world had changed beyond recognition. Before the war, infection was one of humanity's oldest killers, claiming more than 300,000 lives a year in the United States alone, mostly from pneumonia, scarlet fever, and sepsis. In the developing world, wounds and childbirth infections carried death rates of up to 40%. Now, in a single year, penicillin turned those numbers upside down. The mortality from bacterial infections in US hospitals dropped by over 85%. Entire wards, once filled with fever and despair, were suddenly empty, abandoned by death itself. The transformation was so fast it scared even its own creators. Howard Florey, the man who once smuggled mold across oceans, looked at a hospital report from 1947 and murmured, "We've changed the pattern of human fate." He was right. Within 2 years, Pfizer had shifted from producing 21 billion units a year during wartime to over 650 billion units for civilians. Pharmacies filled their shelves with glass ampoules bearing the label Penicillin G. The cost of a dose fell from $20 to less than 50 cents. What had been a secret weapon was now a public right. But peace brought new questions and new warnings. Doctors began using penicillin for everything: a cut, a sore throat, a common cold. Hospitals administered it like candy. The same miracle that had saved millions was now being diluted by excess and ignorance. In 1948, a microbiologist named Mary Barber at Hammersmith Hospital found the first penicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus strain. The bacteria had learned to fight back. Fleming saw it coming. In his Nobel lecture, delivered under chandeliers that glowed like stars, he warned quietly, "The thoughtless person playing with penicillin is morally responsible for the death of the man who succumbs to infection by the resistant organism." The words hung in the air like prophecy. But no one wanted prophecy, they wanted progress. Through the late 1940s, penicillin became the lifeblood of the New World. It crossed oceans faster than armies ever had shipped to Japan, India, Brazil. The United Nations hailed it as the medicine of humanity. By 1950, the World Health Organization credited antibiotics, led by penicillin, for adding 5 full years to the average human lifespan. Factories roared again, this time not for war, but for healing. Deep tank fermenters lined the skylines of New Jersey, London, and Amsterdam. The same engineers who once welded bomber fuselages now built bioreactors. The rhythm of the new age was not the drum of marching boots, but the hiss of steam, the hum of centrifuges, the quiet tapping of glass flasks. And still, the shadow of war lingered behind every success. Scientists remembered where it began: the wounded on Normandy beaches, the fevered in jungle camps, the cries that faded before the cure arrived. Every dose carried the memory of those who hadn't lived long enough to receive it. The legacy of penicillin was not just scientific, it was moral. It proved that the same species capable of creating machines of destruction could also invent something that redeemed its own brutality. The mold had become a mirror, showing humanity both its sickness and its salvation. By 1953, penicillin had inspired an entire generation of antibiotic discoveries: streptomycin, tetracycline, chloramphenicol. The pharmaceutical revolution exploded. Diseases that had stalked humankind for millennia, syphilis, pneumonia, gangrene, were now treatable, sometimes curable. The line between life and death had shifted permanently. Yet somewhere in Oxford, the old laboratories still stood. Dust settled on the wooden benches where Florian Chain had once worked by candlelight. The flasks were empty now, but the walls still carried their echo, the scrape of glass, the whisper of hope. Howard Florey returned there only once, in 1956. He walked through the corridor where, 15 years earlier, he and Chain had tested the first mouse. The building smelled the same: ethanol, mold, time. He smiled faintly and said to a student beside him, "This is where we fought our war." Outside, the world had already moved on: television, jet engines, the dawn of the atomic age. But in every hospital, every pharmacy, every small-town clinic, the quiet miracle still worked its daily magic. By 1960, penicillin had treated over 1 billion infections. By 1970, it was credited with saving over 200 million lives. Numbers so vast they blurred into faith. But history, relentless as ever, left its warning in plain sight. Progress is never a gift, it is a responsibility. The mold that had once humbled death could someday be humbled itself if forgotten, abused, or ignored. And so the story came full circle, from a forgotten petri dish in London to a billion hearts beating across the world. From war's chaos to medicine's quiet triumph. From darkness to a glimmering light that refused to die. Penicillin didn't just save bodies, it changed how humanity measured value. Not in the weight of gold or in the number of victories, but in lives preserved. A single vial had rewritten the balance sheet of civilization. And as the 20th century marched on, dragging dust, hauling blades, still fed by belief, the world carried that small glass symbol forward. Because every generation needs its miracle. Every storm needs its healer. And every war, no matter how dark, leaves behind one fragment of light that refuses to fade. Penicillin was that light. Born from mold, tested by war, sustained by faith, and forever proof that even in the ugliest corners of history, life still finds a way to fight back.